The following message has been brought to you by the Mile High Flood District. Hi, I'm Dave Skuodas, Watershed Manager at the Mile High Flood District. I'm going to talk about a system of open channels we built back in 2016 in the boundary area between Louisville and Lafayette. Here are some photos, courtesy of Dave Crickbaum and Olson, of this lovely area. There were some lessons learned on this project that I will be sharing with you today. There will be two fairly distinct halves to this presentation. In the first half, I'm going to talk about some stream instability we've experienced since the project was built. I'll explain what went wrong with some parts of the channel and why we think that is. In the second half of the presentation, I'm going to share some hard lessons we learned during the unique contractor experience we had. We built the project in two phases with two different contractors, giving us the unique opportunity to compare two low-bid contractors side by side on the same project simultaneously. We documented that experience like an academic exercise, and I'll share that story later on. The primary goal of the project was to reduce flood risk to downtown Louisville, to take the flood risk from this down to this. We had to tear into all of the city streets highlighted in yellow in order to build a 100-year storm drain system to capture stormwater and get it to the open space on the other side of Highway 42. And then we either built or enlarged the open channels through the open space to convey water around 1 mile downstream to Coal Creek. Some of you may remember this project from the CASFM Grand Award presentations back in 2017. These channels pass through open space that's jointly owned by Louisville, Lafayette, and Boulder County. As we presented this project to the various open space advisory boards, a common concern we heard was, are you going to build concrete line channels through our open space? For a lot of these folks, when they heard an engineer talking about drainage, that's the first thing they thought of. I don't know where they would ever get the idea that I would like concrete lined channels. No idea why they would think that. For those of you that haven't seen me present before, yes, that was me in that video, and yes, it was a joke. Okay. And while flood conveyance may have historically used a lot of concrete, at the district we have firmly transitioned to design approaches that mimic natural stream processes as much as possible. When we have enough space, we can construct open channels that can withstand flooding and erosion without expensive structural features made of rock and concrete. In short, we try to create infrastructure that looks like nature. But the context matters. We're in an urban area after all, so flood conveyance is always going to be first and foremost on our list of goals. So the less space we have, the harder it will be to make drainage infrastructure look like nature. There is still a time and a place for sticking pipes in the ground, hopefully only in messy urban retrofit situations like in downtown Louisville on this project. But if that's one end of the spectrum, then a fully naturalized design is on the other end of the spectrum, and there are situations in between these two extremes. When you hear district staff talk about high functioning and low maintenance streams, we really mean highest functioning and lowest maintenance achievable given the context. When we're dealing with greenfield land developments, we insist on wide enough corridors because the width helps us minimize rock and concrete, makes using vegetation for stability possible. When we're in retrofit situations like this one, we start getting into unavoidable trade-offs. On this project, one of our major constraints was property. Even though this may appear to be an expansive open space, it didn't mean that we had access to all of that land for drainage purposes. In order to widen these channels, we had to repurpose open space being used for agriculture and purchase property from an adjacent private landowner who was at times openly hostile to the local governments and to the project. That meant we were forced to make these open channels narrow. Here's a before and after view showing the pre-project channel at the lower end, down how much we were able to widen it. Keep in mind, all of that additional land was private property we had to purchase from the hostile property owner. Here are a couple of our typical cross sections from the project. We were able to get some benches in here and there, but by and large, this was a series of trapezoidal channels with a perfectly straight planform. Of all the options available to us, it was the best. So we did what we could to naturalize the stream corridors, and this meant smaller drop structures, minimizing grout, even using some ungrouted drop structures, all in an attempt to rely on vegetation for stability more so than rock and grout. Here are some photos of the site immediately post-construction where you can see some of our seeding and blanket efforts. This well-intentioned effort to naturalize confined trapezoidal channels is where we ran into some issues that have cropped up post-construction. During the design, the engineering team gave me options with various levels of risk. One of the options they offered used steeper slopes, which meant less drop structures and less cost. But stability would require mature vegetation. Now, when we say steep, we're talking 0.5%, so really not that steep, but given the soil conditions, the engineers were concerned with instability during vegetation establishment. Well, as the project manager, I chose to take on that risk. Experience is invaluable to being good at my job, but it can also get in the way if I mistakenly assume this site is like most of the other sites I've worked on, when in fact, it may not be. The most unique way this site is different than most others I work on is that it just doesn't have that much water. It has way less water than I'm used to working with, particularly as it relates to the daily flows. The watersheds upstream of these channels have been built out for quite some time, and it has a lot of residential area that of course irrigates, but then the channels flow over a mile through pervious open space that contributes almost no runoff. And the watersheds aren't really that big. We're talking hundreds of CFS, not thousands. And then by the time you get to the lower end of the system, almost all of the daily flows have been soaked up. Here is a pre-construction photo near Highway 42. With all of that vegetation, and willows in particular, there's clearly a fair amount of water, but not so much at the downstream end like this photo shows. By this point in the system, all of those daily flows have been soaked up. Here's what this same location looked like when there was more moisture, but certainly still no wetlands to speak of. The existing channels weren't even considered jurisdictional by the Corps of Engineers. So that's a quick nugget I want you all to take away from this presentation. If there's so little moisture that the Corps doesn't even consider the stream to be jurisdictional, that should be a cue as to how much flow you can expect to have helping you establish vegetation. The soils are also quite fine. Here is a photo showing some of the on-site material we had to work with. That means the material will have a higher propensity to erode, particularly when there is a lack of vegetation. So just to recap, at my direction, we built steeper channels with some ungrouted drop structures in a confined system with very little water and fine soils. You can probably guess where this is headed. We started off looking really good. Here's a photo immediately post-construction. You can see our nice blanket work, the shrub plantings, channel bottom looking really stable. Here is one of our ungrouted structures during construction, and then right after final BMPs were installed. Looking good. Here is where we had a couple of channels coming together at a confluence. You can see how fine the channel bottom material looks. Looks like pure sand in this photo. And then here are a few photos after the BMPs were installed and we got some growth. But then looking the other direction at this same location, we'll start to see some of the issues that have popped up. Again, looking good at first, but then notice in this next photo how the bottom of the boulders have become exposed. Here's another view of the same boulders. And that's the district's Mark Schutte in the background. I caught him mid-joke as he was pointing out that the boulders look like teeth with a case of gingivitis. I was bummed that I didn't think of that joke because my wife works in dental. As we look downstream at some of our channel sections, you can see what happened to some of that fine material further down the system. Jim Watt is around 6'4", so that's a good 1 to 2 feet of incision we're looking at. And here he is with Jason Stowski and Mark trying to figure out what the heck went wrong. You can see some of the toe anchors for the blanket exposed here. And then at one of our downstream ungrouted drop structures, the vegetation never grew in to help lock the structure together, and a bunch of material moved on us. This structure may also be a good example of how important it is to make sure material gets chinked into gaps, especially when we're setting boulders into a void-filled riprap mix. We think some of the installation challenges with the chinking could have contributed to rock moving on us. Like maybe we didn't get that locked-in dense rock matrix we like to see. Here is another one of our ungrouted structures, and then here's a photo of the same one taken on the same day we were seeing the eroded drop structure downstream a second ago. This is where we have a lot more daily water up near Highway 42, and this structure seemed to be quite stable. The vegetation grew in and was helping us. When we rely on vegetation for stability, don't take it for granted that we need water to make that possible, the daily water. So we get this frustrating dichotomy that there's more daily water at the upstream end, but more flood water at the downstream end where the contributing watershed is much bigger. Another interesting thing happened with the vegetation as it relates to mowing. I'll show you a series of photos taken from a ped bridge we installed with the project. This panorama shows you the Lafayette portion to the left and the Louisville portion to the right. The channel makes a 90-degree turn at the ped bridge. This view to the west looks at the Louisville channel. Note the vegetation is just starting to pop. This photo taken at the same time looks south at the Lafayette channel. I can't recreate the history on this, but somehow we ended up adding the channel in Lafayette to our routine mowing schedule, but didn't add the channel in Louisville to the mowing schedule. As we fast forward in time of a couple of years, you can see a stark difference in how healthy the vegetation is in the unmowed channel in Louisville versus the mowed channel in Lafayette. And then here is a ground level view of the Louisville unmowed channel, and then on the same day, here is the Lafayette mowed channel. The district has moved away from mowing native areas, and this is a good example of why. This obviously impacted vegetation establishment and surely contributed to the instability we've seen. So what are we going to do here? Well, we're in design for the repairs right now, but it's looking like we need to flatten some of the slopes by installing another grade control structure or two. And we're going to have to repair a few structures that are falling apart, either by converting them to grouted structures or by resetting the rock to get it chinked in better, with perhaps some temporary watering of the vegetation at the repair. In looking at the ungrouted boulder structure, we also think this could function better and retain the smaller rock if we line the boulders up slightly different. You can see the boulders were set next to each other, but leaving some small gaps in the face between the boulders in the downstream direction could lead to more material getting washed through. We think we'd be better off to have the boulders touch each other, overlap a bit in the downstream direction. This should anchor them to each other better and prevent material from being washed through the gaps between the boulders. So the basic takeaways from this portion of my presentation are as follows. When we talk about high functioning and low maintenance, we really mean highest functioning and lowest maintenance that's achievable given the context. When you don't have the water, be realistic about the extent to which you can rely on vegetation for stability, especially for that establishment period. Vegetation is preferred over rock and concrete, but be realistic about it. On this project, the confined corridor, the lack of water, the fine bed material, and the channel slope all contributed to the incision that formed post-construction. The next site you work on will be different than this one, but I hope by seeing this example, it will equip you with good questions to ask so you can avoid some of the repairs we've had to make. Now, I'd like to talk about that contractor experience I mentioned earlier. Many of you watching this presentation are familiar with the district's project partners procurement process. For those that are not familiar, we use a relationship-based project delivery process that relies on multidisciplined design and construction teams with high levels of trust. It most closely resembles a CMGC contract. We do similar work year after year, and we find great value in the long-term relationships we've formed with our design and construction professionals. So our process does not involve open, low-bid contracting. Basing your contractor selection only on the lowest initial bid basically implies that all contractors are interchangeable, and the only distinguishing feature we care about is their initial bid. I say initial because you never know how much a project really costs until it's done. The experience we had on this project perfectly demonstrates that there is value in a contractor well beyond their initial bid price. There are other values that matter, values that are sometimes hard to measure. On this project, there were two fairly distinct types of work. There was the retrofit storm drain in downtown Louisville and the open channel work through the open space. As I mentioned earlier, property acquisition near the open space was challenging, so it took a while. In downtown Louisville, one of the biggest constraints was schedule. Louisville has a really popular farmers market each summer, starting at the end of May. We had a deadline of May 27th to get the area finished enough for the farmers market to open. For these reasons, we broke the project into two phases, so the downtown work wouldn't have to wait on the property acquisition. Louisville received a grant through the state's revolving fund. These are federally sourced dollars, so this drove our project delivery process. In short, this meant we had to use an open, low bid for contractor selection, with Louisville being the contracting agency. So we bid the two project phases separately, and the phases were awarded to two different contractors. We'll call them Contractor 1 and Contractor 2, or Number 2, as I like to call them. For various reasons I won't get into, the two projects ended up starting at the same time, so we had the rare opportunity to compare two contractors who were working side by side on the same project simultaneously. And let me tell you, we had very different experiences with these two. Put more bluntly, Contractor 1 was great. They're one of the district's on-call contractors. Number 2 was horrible. We had issues galore: personnel, quality, safety, schedule, everything. The contrast was stark enough that we decided to quantify the differences in any way we could think of. Mark Schutte, who's now at the district, was the consultant in the field helping us with construction. Mark wrote a short but well-written report to document our findings. So here are a few highlights of the quantifiable comparisons between the two contractors. From a personnel standpoint, and I love that meme, every one of Number 2's people that attended the pre-construction meeting quit the company in the first few weeks of the project at all three of these levels. Not a good sign. Then more quit later on. Number 2 subcontractors were treated poorly. Their subs doing finish work stopped showing up, and the GC would blame the subs for anything that came up. It was all the subs' fault. The city inspector mistrusted everything the GC did, and this mistrust filtered down to the subs' work, so anything being even slightly off had to be reworked. It was a bad day to be a sub on this project. Contractor 1 had the same staff throughout, and their subs showed up. We had a lot of public complaints. Number 2 got ahead of themselves and tore up a road east of downtown, the road in that picture. It was only supposed to be closed for a month, but this stretched to 4 months as they diverted crews back to downtown to meet the farmers market deadline. People couldn't access their driveways. They had to walk a few blocks to get to their cars. They were ticked. And then Number 2's workers were caught a few times helping themselves to garden hoses from people's homes when they needed water. These complaints got directed to the ownership team. We had safety issues with Number 2. Most of these had to do with their open-cut crossing of Highway 42, which you can see in the foreground of that photo. They did such a poor job with their road patching that it had to be repaved a few times, and some drivers were in danger of breaking an axle, including the city's inspector who would pass by each day on his way to work. There were numerous quality issues, and a lot of it was the easy stuff. A few quick examples. On the waterline work, we had lots of megalug fittings. These come with those blue bolts that shear off when you've torqued them enough. Well, all over the place, you'd see these megalug bolts still there when they were ready to bury the thing. With water services, they were supposed to use gate valves, and they buried them before the inspector could look at them. They said, "Oh yeah, we used the right valves." The inspector made them dig them up anyway, and sure enough, they used ball valves instead of gate valves. There were lots of change order requests. Number 2 had 3 times the number of requests than contractor Number 1. Number 2 had a serious lack of professionalism. They would just bombard Mark with poorly organized paperwork and make him figure it out. So that was a lot of field orders and RFIs, lots of iterations on submittal reviews. The 2 overtime requests from Number 2 were for weekend work they needed to meet the farmers market deadline. The deadline was May 27th. They had it ready no sooner than the end of day on May 27th. So yeah, they were paving the road on the last day possible. When it came to pay applications, we couldn't trust any of the quantities Number 2 would submit. Poor Mark earned an honorary CPA keeping track of them. He developed a strong bond with his survey wheel, painstakingly checking quantities each month. And then at one point, number 2 claimed 20 to 30% extra quantity on the asphalt, which of course they didn't bring up before or during the paving, but a few weeks later. Their approach was to toss us a bunch of stuff and then we had to do the work to disprove it. So number 2 generated over double the number of emails per day than number 1, and of course this all leads to more money we had to pay for Mark's time. There were other projects in the area that were waiting on number 2's work. Number 2 took so long in getting things done, we eventually deducted over $450,000 worth of work from their contract and awarded it to adjacent contractors who we trusted. When it came to releasing retainage, this got held up by claims from subcontractors. We held the retainage until we had proof that the subs had been paid. And here's an email from one of the subs number 2 needed a release from. I'll give you a dramatic reading of this. Here's the form you were needing to get your money from the city. We were just needing to make sure blank didn't screw us out of any other money like the concrete work we did for you guys at the Louisville job. Pretty funny how all of a sudden your phone and email works when you want to check. That feeling sucks, doesn't it, when you cannot get an answer from anyone and you're trying to get paid? Hopefully you won't screw over any other subcontractors again. Have a good day. Sometimes sarcasm can be hard to read in an email. This is not one of those times. Okay, so my reason for sharing this story, it was a unique opportunity to compare two contractors. There is a lot of value in having a good contractor that can be hard to quantify. But here you can see measurable differences in personnel, safety, quality, public complaints, and even cost when you look at all of Mark's time, his extra time we had to pay for. For anyone in the owner role watching this, hopefully this is something you could use for justification if you're looking to convince folks in your organization to use a process other than an open low bid. If you email me, I'd be happy to send you a copy of the report this presentation was based on. It's the best 4-page report you'll ever read. And of course, the book I've written, The Effective Client, is also a great resource for this same topic. This was by and large a very successful project. We accomplished what we set out to do. But as with most projects of this size, it wasn't perfect, and I hope the lessons we learned will be useful to you on one of your future projects.